My name is Nick. I'll be hosting the talk today with Geri and Rick. Let me introduce our speakers today. Today we have Geri Spieler and Rick Kaplowitz. Their new book is titled San Francisco Values, Common Ground for Getting America Back on Track. Geri is an investigative journalist. She is the award-winning author of her earlier and critically acclaimed book entitled Taking Aim at the President. Her presentations on internet research methodology have been very well received, both at one of our chapter's monthly meetings and at the National Annual Gathering in Portland. Rick has served as a senior executive both in academia and in technology. He earned his degrees at Brooklyn College, Columbia, and Harvard University. He transferred his membership to our chapter when arriving in the Bay Area in 1990 and has served as our ombudsman from 2011 to 2019. Co-authors Geri and Rick are also husband and wife. So I want to welcome them to the speaker series today and take it away.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Nick, and thank you, San Francisco Regional Mensa, for inviting us to talk with you today. The title of our book has several components. One is San Francisco. That is, to us, the San Francisco Bay Area. A second is values. Values in the Bay Area, values in the country, how the Bay Area seems to lead the country in evolving values, and that ranges in everything from individual freedoms to industry. And third, getting our country back on track. We feel that we have, as very many people have pointed out, become a toxically divided nation. Historically, we're used to two parties. They have somewhat similar overall goals, even if the methodology for getting there have been different, but they've talked to each other. We've had word bipartisan have actual meaning. And that began shifting about 25 years ago. People like Newt Gingrich and Dennis Hastert, Fox News commentators like Bill O'Reilly and Tucker Carlson, are people who use the phrase San Francisco values as a pejorative. They call us un-American in multiple ways. Well, over these past 25 years, and gradually it's actually become, for both parties, both sides, it's become more and more of a we versus them. When the them, whatever side you're on, the them are portrayed as awful people with evil motives, people to be vilified and hated. In fact, in the 2018 election, 34% of all Republican broadcast ads focused on attacking Nancy Pelosi and her San Francisco values. That's 137,000 negative ads, all focused on Nancy, and our values. Now, let me simply illustrate part of the problem. Now, you folks here, and I have to stop, because as soon as I do that and put you in a group, it's stereotyping. It's you and the other. It's we versus they. We would much rather see people interact with other people on a one-to-one basis based on who each individual is, rather than what group they're part of. We'd like to get back on track to the country's aspirational values, that all of us are created equal, that we all have equal rights and opportunities. Presenting our book to you today, we'll nibble at 4 pieces of the book. 2 key issues in the headlines today, and reflect how our book relates to them. And 2 bites about values, America's and San Francisco's, and how the things that we do and believe here in the Bay Area often lead the country and the world. I'll do the first and fourth, and Geri will do the middle 2. Then, as Nick mentioned, we'll be happy to respond to questions relating to any issues touched on in our presentation or elsewhere in the book. Now, the issues that we cover in the book include, but are not limited to, medical decisions being made as political decisions, use of the military, Black Lives Matter, church and state, LGBTQ, integrity versus hypocrisy, immigration, homelessness, innovation in industry, and major political figures, including, of course, as mentioned, Nancy Pelosi, and our VP nominee, Kamala Harris. Please use the chat room button and we'll look at them after we paste the book. Let's look first at Black Lives Matter. The current focus of Black Lives Matter is on the biased nature of interactions between police and people of color. For us, the larger issue is how we in this country have treated and continue to treat people of color inequitably over time. I'm going to read from a section of the book called Race and Equality. Home ownership and education have long been seen as ways for Americans to begin to build a solid financial base for their families. However, the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, which was established in 1934, furthered governmental support of segregation efforts by refusing to insure mortgages in and near African American neighborhoods, a policy known as redlining. At the same time, the FHA was subsidizing builders who were mass producing entire subdivisions, all whites, with covenants that none of the homes could be sold in the future to African Americans. The GI Bill, passed after World War II as a way to enable returning troops to catch up on the economy for their time in service, provided education and housing benefits, but the GI Bill was not uniformly applied. For example, Black veterans in a vocational training program at a segregated high school in Indianapolis were unable to participate in activities relating to plumbing, electricity, and printing because adequate equipment was only available to white students. At the college level, 95% of Black vets were shunted off to Black colleges. With respect to housing, only 2 of the more than 3,200 VA guaranteed home loans in 13 Mississippi cities in 1947 went to Black borrowers. And it wasn't only in the South. In New York and the northern New Jersey suburbs, fewer than 100 of the 67,000 mortgages insured by the GI Bill supported home purchases by non-whites. And things are still unequal. In 2018, Black and Asian applicants in Camden, New Jersey were respectively 2.6 and 1.8 times more likely than whites to be denied home loans, even after adjustments for income, loan amount, and neighborhood. Furthermore, this inequality simply continues today. 2 items from the news in the past include, first of all, from July 15th, 2020, lending discrimination within the Paycheck Protection Program. The Paycheck Protection Program, the PPP, is a federal lending program that provides money to small businesses to help them weather the economic effects of the pandemic. The National Community Reinvestment Coalition conducted matched pair audit testing of financial institutions in Washington, D.C. Matched pair testing is a method used to detect discrimination by using a pair of testers with different races or other protected classes, but similar profiles as a way to determine differences in treatment from financial institutions. Our findings show that there were statistically significant disparities between the groups of testers using the chi-square difference test across the marketplace. We found a difference in levels of encouragement in applying for a loan, a difference in products offered, and a difference in the information provided by the bank representative. And on July 30th, Reuters reported the 10 congressional districts with the lowest Black populations got over 64,000 more PPP loans than the 10 districts with the most Black residents.
Thank you, Rick. All right, so let's shift our focus to values for a bit. Several of the San Francisco values that we discuss are personal freedom in love and marriage, personal sovereignty, that is, our bodies belong to us. We embrace the values and the richness of our human differences, including race, religion, gender, and national origins. We want integrity, again, not hypocrisy. So here are 2 quotes which start chapter 4. The first quote is from San Francisco Gay Men's Chorus. Yes, be afraid of the gay agenda. We are coming for your children, and we are going to make them tolerant. The second quote is from a Bay Area transplant from the East Coast. He said, in Massachusetts, you can be anyone you want to be, as long as you do it in your home, behind closed doors, and you don't talk about it in public. In San Francisco, you can be anyone you want to be, and you can do it out loud in public, and there are probably 3 support groups for it. So it's our perspective that the values that we honor and live in the Bay Area often lead to evolutionary change in our nation, and sometimes in the world. One good example of that leadership is marriage equality. That is, the right for any 2 people to marry and equal rights for all couples. So let's open a window for a moment to the year 2004. In that year, Pew Research Center poll found 2-to-1 margin. That is, 60% of Americans opposed same-sex marriage, 31% supported it. Now, remember those figures. It was also in 2004, after taking office in February, San Francisco Mayor Gavin Newsom took a very gutsy stand, openly challenging California's license law by allowing same-sex couples to receive marriage licenses and get married. Between February 11th and March 11th, 2004, more than 3,000 couples took advantage of the short window that Mayor Gavin Newsom had opened. Then between March 2004 and June of 2015, there were legal and legislative battles culminating in the Supreme Court's decision supporting same-sex marriage. I'm going to read from the section entitled Evolving Sexual Values. We often trace a country's shifting values through its media. American viewpoint has changed over the years, moving toward an increasing acceptance of LGBTQ relationships. Here are 3 out of many examples that reflect the growing acceptance of those dynamics across America. In 2005, the movie Brokeback Mountain sensitively portrayed the gay relationship between 2 cowboys played by Heath Ledger and Jake Gyllenhaal. It was a box office hit. It was also nominated for 8 Oscars and won 3 of them, including Best Director. Jill Soloway's comedy series, Transparent. It began airing on Amazon in 2014 when Jeffrey Tambor, playing Morton, the father of the Pfefferman family, announced to his family that he was beginning his transition into the woman Maura. The show won Golden Globe for Best Series and has had multiple Golden Globe and Emmy nominations. Tambor received 22 major acting award nominations, and he won 13 of them. Jane Fonda and Lily Tomlin star in the Netflix streaming Grace and Frankie. Airing since 2015, the women learned that their husbands, played by Martin Sheen and Sam Waterston, who were partners in a law firm, were also romantically involved with each other for 20 years. The couple split, the 2 men marry, and the 2 women evolved their own friendship. The show has a strong audience and has been nominated for 5 Emmys and won a Golden Globe Award. Now, you remember those statistics from 2004, when Newsom first opened the door, Americans who opposed same-sex marriage by 2-to-1 margin. Well, the Pew Research Center found that in 2019, the numbers were just reversed. That is, 61% of Americans supported same-sex marriage, while 31% oppose it. And there are currently 29 countries that support same-sex marriage and is legal. Now, let's look at a very different arena in which our Bay Area leadership is evident, in the world of computer technology. I'm going to read from the section titled Computer Tech. In the 1960s, America's electronic technology was emerging in 2 key locations: along the Route 128 belt in Massachusetts that curves in an arc around Boston, and on the peninsula south of San Francisco. Both areas drew upon strong university resources. Cambridge with the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and Harvard University that fueled the 128 developments. Stanford University provided the primary core in California. Starting about even in the 1960s, California's Silicon Valley encompassing the area from San Francisco moved significantly beyond the Route 128 center to become the preeminent national and international computer tech. A casual conversation with a very high-level Wang Labs operative in Lowell, Massachusetts in the latter half of the 1970s contained a significant foretelling of the shift that was about to take place. That Wang policymaker shelled what would prove to be the company's mistaken, short-sighted, and fatal perspective. He said, "Small computers are a nice toy, but they can't possibly replace the word processing technology that we have developed for the printing and publishing world." Several authors have examined and analyzed in depth the evolution of the preeminence of Silicon Valley. In her 1994 Inc. article, Silicon Valley versus 128, Annalee Saxenian, Dean of the School of Information at the University of Wisconsin-Berkeley, detailed the business crises that simultaneously hit each area when Silicon Valley chip makers were overtaken by the Japanese semiconductor industry. And Route 128 mini computer companies were overtaken by the shift to workstations and personal computers. Supported by in-depth studies of several specific companies in each setting, Saxenian concludes that while Silicon Valley's successful emergence and new growth was built on a culture that evolves and promotes collective learning and flexible adjustment, and companies that make specialty products with a broad range of related technologies. She also cites the region's social networking and open labor markets, which encourage entrepreneurship and experimentation. In contrast, the Route 128 region's industrial system contains vertically integrated independent companies that largely keep to themselves. Secrecy and corporate loyalty have governed relations between more traditionally organized companies and their customers, suppliers, and competitors, reinforcing a culture that encourages stability and self-reliance with centralized authority and information that tends to flow vertically only. In 2019, demographics expert Paul Mackin traced industrial evolution in these two areas. In his netvalley.com article, Silicon Valley and Route 128, Two Faces of the American Technopolis, in comparing the histories, attitudes, and strategies most conducive to long-term success in the two settings, Mackin observed a direct contrast between Silicon Valley's reliance on risk-taking and partnerships and Eastern Massachusetts' emphasis upon convention, decorum, and self-reliance. Elizabeth Charnock of Bloomberg focuses on Silicon Valley's unique approach to failure as what makes the region very successful, observing, the mantra adopted by Silicon Valley is fail fast, while the rest of the world follows the mantra don't fail. During the dot-com boom years between 1995 and 2000, it was not uncommon for Silicon Valley investors to hear venture capital proposals for funding include a statement such as, two principals in the new company have each had two previous failures in their new ventures. And they really learned from that. Rick?
Probably the single topic dominating the news today is clearly the coronavirus. And a major aspect of that is the relationship between medical care and politics. As you're undoubtedly aware, many Republican governors, following the lead of their Republican president, chose to diminish the threat of the virus rather than impose the kinds of limits that have proven effective both in this country and in the world in managing the spread of the disease. This mix of politics and medicine is not new this year. This is taken from a section of the book called A Healthy Nation. Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, the ACA, was designed as part of the safety net to make insurance for medical care available to all citizens. The implementation of the ACA became highly politicized, with red or Republican-leaning states choosing to oppose the act and not implement the expanded Medicare option, and blue Democratic-leaning states moving forward to make it available to all their citizens. Missouri has been a political swing state throughout the 20th and the 21st centuries. Oh, excuse me for a second. Throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, Missouri's state motto is, "Let the welfare of the people be the supreme law." While 57% of eligible and previously uninsured residents in Missouri did enroll for medical insurance under the ACA, the Missouri legislature, which has been heavily Republican since 2001, has not opted to take advantage of the ACA opportunity to expand Medicaid. Therefore, about 23% of potentially eligible uninsured residents fall into a so-called coverage gap. This means that they make too much to qualify for Medicaid, but too little to qualify for income-based subsidies to buy coverage under the ACA. Does this approach help provide for the welfare of the people of Missouri? The ACA, including the enhanced Medicaid option, has proven its value. In September 2019, JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, reported an increasing number of studies have provided rigorous evidence that Medicaid expansion, which has increased the number of Medicaid recipients by more than 10 million since 2013, has been associated with improved health of low-income U.S. residents in various ways, including self-reported health, acute and chronic disease outcomes, and mortality reductions. It would appear that those state governments that choose to adopt the ACA's opportunity to expand Medicaid did indeed provide more adequately for the welfare of their citizens than Missouri and other non-participating states. Now, to wind up, in addition to major issues, our book reviews some of the colorful events in history that made San Francisco great, including things like the bordellos of the gold rush, for one example. For another, one of the people who stood out as an individual in San Francisco, where it's really rather hard to stand out unless you're very far out, was Emperor Norton. In San Francisco in 1859, Joshua Abraham Norton proclaimed himself Imperial Majesty Emperor Norton I, Emperor of these United States. As described on a Voice of America broadcast, Emperor Norton usually did not have any money, but he did not need any. If Emperor Norton went to a restaurant, he was served a meal, free. If he needed something little from a store, that was also freely given. Sometimes he paid with his own kind of money, paper money with his picture on it. Some stores even began placing a small sign in their windows reading, "By appointment to His Majesty, Emperor Norton I." Stores with these signs noted that their business increased. Friends and neighbors glorified Norton's regal presence and his self-designed blue and gold uniform. His proclamations were announced in the local press, including his order that the U.S. Congress be dissolved by force. His decrees, while sometimes compelling in content, had no power in fact. Yet his presence was felt as a strong part of the city's ethos. Here's a piece of his story not often told. At one point, a group organized an anti-Chinese committee, which set out to foment violence in the city's Chinese neighborhoods. One night, members of that committee left the meeting and walked toward the area of the city where most of the Chinese live. As they got closer to the area, one man stood in the street, blocking their way. He said nothing. He did not move. The mob of troublemakers stopped. They looked at Emperor Norton, standing in his old blue uniform with its gold-colored buttons. They said nothing. They did nothing. Slowly, the mob turned and walked away. We hope that gives you a flavor of the range and the depth of San Francisco values. The book provides both a background and an examination of current issues. Each chapter concludes with some action steps to help you evaluate the candidates and the issues. And it's been said that this book is the book that you need to read before going into the voting booth this fall. The San Francisco Values is, of course, available through local bookstores and on Amazon. Now, with Nick's help, we'd like to take a look at any questions that you may have posed. It says, just an FYI, Missouri residents passed the constitutional amendment last month to bypass the legislature and approve Medicaid expansion. Yes, they did. They got tired of the lack of this attention and of the government not doing what was good for the people, and they actually did that. It's within the last 30 days.
Yeah.
Thanks, Barry.
One of the things that I'm always surprised at is that San Francisco gets attacked as being immigrant-loving socialists against the country, against capitalism. And the business pages talk about Elon Musk and Tesla as being one of the most valuable companies in the country now. Elon is an immigrant. He's a hyper-capitalist. We have Sand Hill Road, which has all of the venture capitalists in the country, really, the majority of them. Any comments about this?
Well, when we were looking at some of the technology in Silicon Valley companies, one of the statistics that came up was how many of the companies were started by immigrants, large portion of them, and also that on the boards, at least 1 out of every 3 people that sit on a board is an immigrant. I mean, Sergey Brin, Google, is from Russia. I mean, we have a whole section of the book about the different, technology companies and who started them. So we really investigated that thoroughly. And you're right, a lot of immigrants have done, not just in Silicon Valley, but our whole country.
Immigration is also important, more important here. Part of the reason, perhaps, we have twice the percentage of immigrant citizens of the country as a whole. And 28% of people in the Bay Area speak 2 languages at home, and 14% of that is the country as a whole. So we welcome, we embrace our immigrants, which is one of the factors that's different. There's a note here from Lindy that said, did you get into San Francisco food, the wide variety, the high quality, etc.? No,
Not
not something
really.
we really talked about. But I think maybe you can reflect that based on the immigrant portion,
Right,
because we do have that great wealth of
restaurant.
kitchens from around the world. And of course, the other part of it is the same food is available in every culture in the world. Like, everybody's got ravioli, only have different names for it.
So I had a question. I've heard like a distressing statement online that we are operating in a post-truth atmosphere right now, whether that's because of our government or our leadership or whatever, right? So, the things that you're saying seem very right to me. I agree with them, but I think one of the difficulties that I see is getting people who don't agree or may not be inclined to agree with what is said in your book. How do you have a discussion with those people to help them get past the blockage to just look at new ideas, right?
One of the things we talked about, thanks Nick, on the beginning of the book is that we don't talk to each other. And I think, we would love to have everybody read the book, but the fact is people live in an echo. They watch the news that they agree with. They read, newspapers and things that they agree with. So it would be great to be able to have a real conversation. I have to tell you, I'm not optimistic, and that's unfortunate.
One of the questions that Anna Eshu put out that I think we actually quoted in the book is, where do you get your news? And that's an important, interesting, perhaps, place to begin. If people aren't getting it, or are getting it from just such diverse places and don't get some sense of what's happening in both. There's even a website that shows the news each day from both sides and how each side has responded to it. That's something that's a little bit different.
We have a question in the chat. It says, I believe New York City and Miami and other key East Coast cities have also gone through periods with government by recent immigrants.
I'm not quite sure what government by recent immigrants means. Could you clarify that a little bit?
It just means that no longer were the original or the first wave of settlers in charge. In Boston, the Irish took over from the English. In New York City, the Italians took over from previous. In Miami, the Cuban immigrants, once they had citizenship, in every case, this was once there was citizenship, they took over from the previous majority and ran those cities. And one of the comments that you guys made was San Francisco was being, I'm not sure how to describe it, being treated suspiciously because we had so many immigrants in our government. And that could well be true, and it's if that's the case, they've forgotten their own history back east.
It's true. It's true. We can look at several places. We can look at, I grew up in Brooklyn, and in Brooklyn we had exactly that wave that you're talking about of each immigrant group passing by and moving into the same housing that the prior immigrant group had lived in. But if you look at the earlier part of the country, most of our immigrants, the earliest part of our country, our immigrants came from Asia. But that's what we call Native Americans, but they came 22,000 years ago. But they came from China. But in the last 400 years, the first group of immigrants came from primarily Western Europe, and then things began to shift to Central and Eastern Europe, and there were all kinds of rules against that, and quotas, and then, of course, quotas and issues with Asian immigrants, the Chinese Exclusion Acts and our Japanese in camps in the 40s. It's not necessarily in government. To me, that leads to a different question. I look at the LGBTQ community in the 70s in San Francisco when the gay men came together and got involved with the politics of the city and got all kinds of legislation passed for equality and openness for the gay community. In the 80s, those same people were politically active, but they then became active in all of the issues of San Francisco. So once people become part of it, it seems to me that it becomes more of an inclusive process. Or if you go back to the earliest years, the fires in San Francisco.
Yeah, about people coming together. Yeah, I mean, that was one of the things we talk about is how did San Francisco become San Francisco? And, why is it this, embracing community that stands out in the world? And even though there were, problems against the Chinese and the Japanese, for the large part, when there were fires, and there were 6 fires before 1906, that the communities had to come together to survive and to fight the fires and to rebuild. So that's, that came later. And of course, the gold rush brought people from all over the world, but they weren't necessarily getting along, and there were a lot of claim jumping. But there's different things that happened, throughout the years that made San Francisco what it is today. And that's one of the things that, we talk about specifically in the book, about, how they embraced each other, and also the difficulties. It's not a perfect world, it's not a perfect city, it's not a perfect area, but it's certainly way ahead of a lot of other parts of the country. The question there?
Nick, did you want to move on to other questions for us? We can pick it up. What about the sexual values? Lindy asked, what about sexual values of the 60s and how the Bay Area has become much more conservative over the years? E.g., where did body exchange bars go?
I'm not familiar with body exchange bars.
Lindy, did you want to expand on that just a little bit?
No, I was hoping you would. It's just, I remember it being so much more free and easy in the 60s.
Well, I think that the biggest issue that happened was AIDS. Yeah.
Right.
And so that's when the gay baths shut down. The Sutro baths was a wonderful place, but needed to shut down, as did a lot of the bars. Right now, again, there is another issue going on because of the virus. A number of the transgender gathering bars have closed, not just temporarily, but they have closed. There are fewer gay bars. Lesbian bars have generally been a little bit lower visibility, but very present for the lesbian community. But I think it's disease that's been the real issue.
Makes sense. Thank you.
If you haven't addressed it yet, what is your bottom line? What points would you like us to take away with? Came in a note.
It's the end of every chapter.
Well, there are some pieces of advice in every chapter where we encourage people to examine who people are, what they represent. We spend several pages in the book talking about a lack of integrity, where we talk about a number of legislators who have all been very strong against gay rights, against gay marriage, same-sex marriage, but in particular against gay rights, and how it was legislator after legislator who was found in bed with his baggage boy, the rent boys, the traveling, but the hypocrisy, item after item after item. We have no problem with those people sleeping with whoever they want to. We have a problem with them being against other people sleeping with it and then going ahead and doing it themselves.
Yeah.
So what we would like the people to take away on a personal level is sort of implied and built into the question Nick was asking, talking to each other. How do you talk to each other so that you get past just the slogans and actually start getting to a place? There have been some small experiments where people have been brought together who were diametrically opposed, and almost invariably they walk away not necessarily convinced of the other side, but much more receptive to the possibility that the other side may have some reasonable positions as well.
One of the things, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
One of the things that we talk about in the book, and like I said, at the end of every chapter, we have takeaways of people to look at something. That one of the things we want people to do is to look at the person who's running for office, and does that person represent your values? And or are you a one issue, voter? But like I said, the book is centered on reading the chapter, looking at the takeaways, and asking yourself some questions based on the subject of that chapter.
There's another question here that said, would you care to comment on growing income inequality in San Francisco? We do talk some about the cost of living here. Income inequality is an issue across the country. And again, like so many other things in San Francisco, we're sort of visible near or at the head of the pack here and in New York City because the large industry is here and income inequality is greater. It's a national issue. We do talk about homelessness as well. And Jim, did you want to go further?
Yeah, it seems to be more enhanced in San Francisco, where somebody has to live 2.5 hours away from downtown to work to support the wealthy people who are involved in, say, high tech. My son lived in San Francisco for a number of years on Pacific Avenue. Nice but small place until the landlord figured out how to get out of rent control. And then he had to move away.
Yeah. We have also talked about some of the construction people who have their RVs, not just homeless people, but they might live in Fresno, but they have a really good job in San Francisco on a project. So they have an RV that they live in during the week and go home on the weekends. And that also speaks to the fact that people who work here can't always live here. And it's evolving. I mean, cities evolve anyway. It doesn't make it easier, and it's really sad when somebody's lived in an apartment for 20 years and ends up getting kicked out. That's not okay, but it's happened. And a lot of it had to do with the tech industry and the growth of the tech industry and people coming here getting great big salaries, and they don't want to live in Palo Alto. They want to live in San Francisco because it's a cool place to be. And that's unfortunate. We don't have an answer to that, but we do address it.
We recognize it. It's really an issue. One of the other pieces too that's interesting to us as we were doing our research, San Francisco keeps on getting the headlines. We and deservedly in some cases, but homelessness in San Francisco is a problem. And again, we talk about that in detail. But San Francisco is either 8th or 9th in the country as cities with a homeless problem proportional to population. And yet the headlines talk about homelessness in San Francisco, in San Francisco, in San Francisco. So it's fun to see, but it all makes you scratch your head a little bit.
Yeah. Well, it's easier to pick on us as opposed to other cities.
Yeah, because we just laugh being picked on. There was another question. What was your process for getting your book published? We went to some transition. The problem for us was the timetable. Jerry's last book was published by a major publisher. We would have expected to do that again, but we were writing this book last fall, and we wanted it out this year.
Spring, actually, yeah.
Well, we finished it, yeah, we was writing it last fall. We were editing it this spring. In order to get it out this spring, the end of this spring, we went to what's called a hybrid publishing, which is not quite self-publishing and not quite traditional. And that was our choice and decision to get it published so that it would be out timely.
For most traditional publishers, the process can be 9 months to a year. And we were talking to traditional publishers. They liked the book, but they couldn't, what they call crash it, which is an industry term, getting it out sooner, like the, John Bolton's book,
Yeah,
or Michael Cohen's book.
Yeah.
They'll get those out overnight.
Those are out in 48 hours. but other than that, we don't have quite that platform.
Yeah.
There's a question from J.C. Jackson. San Francisco and some of the rest of the Bay Area have grown themselves some national resentment over a few policies, one being rejecting a full military presence and broadcasting a relatively large and shrill Soviet sympathy, and allowing an extensive revenge-style reverse racism and ensure we have a bad national rep. I wonder how we're likely going to reverse this bad rep. There's a whole lot of stuff in there, JC. Let me try to tease out a couple of pieces of that first. Just talking about the military presence, just as an easy one. One of the leaders for our country and coming out of the Bay Area is Barbara Lee. And Barbara Lee, as you know, was the one vote against the, I'm sorry, I'm not remembering the exact name of, I'm sorry, what?
The Iraq War?
Yeah, but this piece of legislation that everybody, Barbara Lee was the one vote against it, and has been making the point over time, and the vote has gotten better and better. In 2017, her committee, which was both Republicans and Democrats, reported out a majority favoring getting rid of that legislation and restructuring it. That has not passed because the Senate is what it is. Legislation that gives the president basically freedom to send troops any place he or she wants, anytime they want to.
How are they going to change the Constitution?
They're not going to change the
It
Constitution.
was the use of force authorization for Bush.
Thank you.
But that doesn't stop the president from sending troops. Read the Constitution, and my dad was career military. I can guarantee you, I've been through ROTC in college. The Constitution says he's the CIC, the commander in chief, and where he says the troops go, they go, and that has been put through the courts. The authorization is you have to go back and get funding for others, this, that, and the other. And we went through this all through Vietnam in the 60s.
Congress has to declare war. The president does not declare war.
And I'm afraid that's not true, and that's been tried through the courts.
Yeah.
As to the Soviet-style sympathies, Barbara Lee is one of the worst cases to send anywhere, because she is one of the chief Cuban Soviet-style sympathizers. I know people resent this stuff because I have been in an industrial situation where I was sharing supplies around the country with a major national corporation. We had to ship stuff back and forth. And I kept getting this resentment from these guys till we had a couple of conventions, and they really, just off the cuff, from the ground up, from clerks up to managers, resent California. And one of the keys is the appearance of Soviet-style politics.
Well, I'm not going to get into a discussion of what Soviet-style politics are. I don't see San Francisco as having Soviet-style politics. If I wanted to pursue Soviet at this point, I'm not sure that the relationship between our president and Russia is one that is in the country's best interest. But we talk about, the question also was about, our being hostile to the military. We have not been hostile to the military. That we housed the military from the time that San Francisco was really fairly early into the 60s and 70s and the 1800s. In the 1960s and beyond, military bases were taken and moved to the south. That was political. It was, some of it was a trade-off that Johnson made in exchange for getting the legislation passed in 64 and 65 for voting rights and so on. And that was part of the trade-off that he had to make with Southern legislators. So
again, the perceptions of these guys from back east, and I was living in California at the time when various well-known politicians today were involved in San Francisco city government. And basically, during Jerry Brown and similar times, for instance, they refused to moor at the battleship Missouri here in the Bay Area. There were all kinds of things going on then. And right now, in the recent years, when the federal government has subtracted a block from California from the budget and given it to other states, that block totals out, every time they do that, that block totals out to be about the amount of money that California would be seeing from the military were they still stationed here. Now, I was here, I remember them going away. And it wasn't just due to the people moving to the south. They were closing depots all over the country. But California was hostile to the military and continues to be.
One last piece, and then we'll go on to another question, but there have been demonstrations against the military, and at the same time, when a military recruiting office in Berkeley, the sort of the center of a lot of anti-military, there were people objecting to it, and people demonstrated to support the right of that office to be there, even though the majority of people weren't particularly supporting it. There is a question here from Lindy that says, do you get into educational opportunities in the book? I've heard that San Francisco has good high schools. Has that changed? Being a child of the 60s, I remember San Francisco had free universities, which seem to have disappeared. The benefit of those was that anyone who had an area of specialization could teach it on a volunteer basis. That was true across the country in terms of the free universities that grew during hippie era, and a lot of that came out of starting with grade inflation, when having good grades and staying in school could keep you out of the draft. Colleges and universities began, in some cases, simply everybody got an A and they stayed out of the draft, and you had a whole lot of issues about that. And then you also had free universities open up. Those have kind of gone away. They've gone away in a different way too. I went to Brooklyn College. My fees were $350 a year. And that was simply fees. I paid no tuition. In California, the University of California system was magnificent. Universities across the country have become structured very differently financially. And what we had, the 60s, a long time back.
We also are known to have some great universities in the Bay Area. Stanford and Berkeley and Menlo Park, but also University of San Francisco, as well as excellent medical care. And we're known for that, and we're proud of that. I think that the high schools are having problems everywhere in terms of funding, as in San Francisco has had some problems as well.
Jerry's had a small problem lately because as a Bay resident, she was very proud of the fact that Berkeley was considered the best public university in the country. And now, this last year, Berkeley is second to UCLA, which is where she went. So she really isn't sure of where her priorities are and her loyalties.
But I am a UC student.
But that's in terms of cost. And yes, and Linda, you're saying, yeah, the free universities were open to freedom. They sort of disappeared with the hippies. Do we have anything else that we wanted to do? Is there another question is what I'm looking for? JC, I have a feeling that your perspectives and ours are not exactly, and I'll speak for me, mine aren't exactly the same. And that's the kind of situation, and this isn't the setting, but I think if we were able to sit down together and go through some of the things that you're talking about in more detail and that we're talking about, we might find some commonalities as well as some differences in perspective. I look back at Kennedy Kassenbaum, or I look back at Barbara Boxer and Jim Inhofe. Those are two examples of senators where in each case they were on opposite issues on opposite positions on almost every issue that came up. But they found common areas where they could put legislation together that was good for the country, that met the needs of both sides. And I believe that there are ways that we can do that. As I say, this isn't the forum to do it in, but I think that that's what we talk about, people talking to each other as individuals, instead of putting labels on groups. We would be able to find some common ground.
Well, I'll echo that statement. Thank you so much for being here, Geri and Rick. This was a great conversation. And for everybody who is here and everybody who watches this later on YouTube, this is San Francisco Regional Mensa's monthly gathering. And this is the exact type of discussion that we want to foster inside of Mensa. Differing perspectives, talking about our own experiences, listening to each other, respectfully talking and understanding. And this has been a really great presentation. So I want to thank you to our speakers, Geri and Rick. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us, all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I will hope to see you around at another event soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick.
Bye-bye.
Bye.